So, Carmela, as someone who's described themselves as an old school goth and having been immersed in that culture for a while, with having a clothing company and you, now with your writing, what is it about that culture that spoke so loudly to you?
I think it's as much the fact that I never seem to fit into mainstream culture than anything else. But I loved horror when I was growing up. I've always loved horror. The music, the punk and the goth and the more operatic sounds sort of resonate with me. So it's very much about the music as well. But also, I felt more comfortable in the goth scene with the gender roles because they're a lot more fluid. And I always found the expectations of being female a little bit hard to live up to. So it was lovely to be in a scene where that was so relaxed as it is, certainly in the UK goth scene.
Is there something to be said for finding your place in this world or having a place, or does that bring a certain comfort, or does that help you in any way with your artistry?
Well, I think I have my tribe, people I've known I can draw from, and a lot of the people who are bigger in the scene also have their own legends as well. So there's that, but also my biggest fans tend to be from the goth scene. So I'm imagining that some of the things that I'm saying in my books are certainly resonating as true for other people within the scene. And although do seem to have a wider appeal than that, the hardcore fans definitely seem to be old goths like myself.
Nice. That's awesome. That's cool that you have a niche like that. It's pretty rare for a writer.
Well, they say write what you know. it's,
They
it's
do.
kind of it's kind of a scene that I've been in as pretty much the outsider because I've always been quite a shy person. It was only really when we started the business, which was probably more my partner at the time's idea than mine, that I really started to have quite a central part in the scene. Before then, I was definitely one of the people on the edges. The wolf, well, not a wallflower because I love to dance, but not somebody sort of in the inner cliques either. So it's interesting. I've seen it as an outsider. And I've kind of glimpsed it as an insider as well, getting invited to wonderful parties and things.
Nice.
But I've always felt a bit of an outsider, I think, wherever I am.
What is your writing process? Are you a pantser, plotter? How would you describe yourself?
Absolutely a pantster, and I tend to start with the characters first.
Oh.
I tend to have a much stronger idea of who I'm writing about than the plot, and it seems to be my characters that actually inform the plot as I go along. And yes, when it comes to rewriting, I'll tidy up. I think Neil Gaiman says something like, if you want a plan, what you do is you write your first draft and then jot down what happens, and there you go. You had a plan all along. And I'm like that. And once I've written out the scenes and what the characters do and how they react in a way that feels real and authentic to me, then I can kind of work the plot in, make sure there's enough action to keep people interested.
Nice. You, in one interview, you mentioned a great quote that's one of my favorites as well from Stephen King about you write your first draft with the door closed, and then you write your second and subsequent drafts with the door open.
Absolutely. I mean, it's vital because you want to make sure that you're not just writing for yourself. I mean, although that's perfectly legitimate. I mean, if you want to be a serious writer and have an audience, you have to be aware of that audience. But when you're starting, it is so personal and you can't afford to be too critical of yourself because that shuts the imagination down immediately. So what you're doing is you're tapping into sometimes, particularly with myself, quite dark places. And having anybody judging that can be quite destructive on a personal and on a creative level. So once I very rarely show anything unless it's at least in the second or third draft, because by that point, I know that I've smoothed out the edges and removed anything that I think maybe speaks a bit too deeply about things that I was thinking that maybe aren't appropriate for a wider audience. And then I open those doors and I say, well, what do you think? I've got a wonderful team of beta readers. I just couldn't do the job without them. They're fantastic. So normally at least a few of them are available at any time and they'll have a look through and they'll give me honest feedback. They'll say, well, that character really spoke to me, but that one seemed a bit weak. or that scene seemed really implausible. You know, how can you tighten that up? And then I'll go away and I'll probably rewrite a couple more times before I even start the editing process. I think because I don't plan and nothing is kind of written in stone from the start, it gives me the flexibility to let the story grow in quite a fluid, organic way. I mean, I was saying earlier about sort of the goth scene and the fluidity being important to me. That's important to me in my stories as well. I'm forever changing, and I like to keep my art changing as well. It certainly feels more fresh to me that way.
I'm curious if there's one thing though that you feel is missing in the horror genre that maybe your writing provides.
It's very female orientated, but still visceral. I wouldn't say that there aren't great female horror writers, because there are. But I would say that great horror writers who are published are a minority, and an awful lot of the female writers that I have dealing with are more sort of writing paranormal romance and then potentially marketing it as horror. So I think although there are some gothic romance elements to some of my writing, it's very much in the background. I suppose it's a character story, but it's not the plot, it's not the drama. It is very much about, how bad can this get? And in that way, and I suppose also the magical influences. Now, they're probably a little bit more common in the horror genre, but magic and esotericism is something that I find fascinating. And I find fascinating as well the idea that perception can color your reality, and how you perceive a situation becomes the reality for you, even if it's completely different to someone else. And you don't have to be mentally ill for that. It can just be your own experiences. So I think sort of because as a survivor of trauma, perception of situations can be possibly a lot darker than someone else's, and so perhaps I'm bringing that into the mix as well.
That being said, is there a cliche that you do embrace within your writing that's typical with the horror genre?
Well, I had the diabolic pregnancy. I don't suppose you can get much more tropey than that, can you? So yes, I do. I mean, I try when I use them to invert them, but even so, it can be so difficult because you're surrounded by these ideas, and they kind of they get their way into you, right. And half the time you're not even aware. And it was only really after finishing the Starblood book that I thought, oh, what did I just do?
So I'm kind of curious too, as a pantser, you've written a trilogy, and I'm wondering how, as a pantser and as somebody who is very aware of their writing style and trying to avoid a cliche or two, how you designed the reveal process for the trilogy. How much of it were you very careful to plan out? How much of it happened after you wrote or before you wrote? And did it get easier as you went into each book?
To answer the last question first, yes, because I knew the characters. And so I was introducing a far fewer new characters that I had to learn everything about. So yes, it became much, much easier. When I wrote Starblood, I actually wrote it as a standalone novel. I had no intention to make it into a series because, in fact, although Starblood is currently a trilogy, I'm writing a 4th book. So it'll be a series next year or the year after. And this one kind of follows on with Freya. So she was one of the sort of secondary characters in the 1st book and kind of came into her own a bit more in the 2nd. So basically, the 4th book is going to be revolving around her. I felt she had more to say, and I really had tortured her, so I thought I'd torture her some more. I had no idea when I wrote Starblood of what was going to happen in Psychonaut or Black Sun. So what I had to do was make sure that I understood what had happened in the previous books, write a timeline so I didn't mess up, and then start the next one. When it came from Starblood to the transition to Psychonaut, it wasn't too difficult because Psychonaut was a very different book. I mean, in some ways it was more fantasy than horror, although there was a lot of visceral violence in it, because most of the action takes place on the plains, on the Tree of Life and the Kabbalah. So they're actually taking place in these mystical places that are really more a projection of the mind than sort of physical places in the real world. And each of those has their lessons that need to be learned. So I had quite a lot, not only from Starblood to refer back to, but also the Kabbalic writings. I kind of leaned quite heavily on Dion Fortune for the book, and what these places mean, and what the hero had to learn from them in order to be able to progress further and have any chance of getting anywhere. So that was really quite interesting. And then when Black Sun came along, well, it didn't just come along, I wrote it, of course. I was kind of then bringing in the elements from the other worlds and then bringing them back to, our world. So that was quite interesting. Because I knew the characters so well and knew what they'd do in any given situation, pretty much, I could tell straight away if something wasn't going to work. If I needed Satori to do X and I thought there's no way, he just wouldn't. He'd just laugh at that.
As someone who has written multiple books, what do you think is the most important thing that you've learned from the process that you didn't know going in that you now apply to everything going forward?
Not to look for perfection in the first instance. Just write what you feel and then sort it all out at the end. Because when I started out, every line I was scrutinizing, and it could take me weeks to get a page I was happy with. Well, that's no use to anyone, and your brain just freezes up. Your creative process is done. So when I first did NaNoWriMo, which of course is coming up, National Novel Writing Month, for that you had to write at least 1,667 words per day, and you were not allowed to edit or delete anything. So you were basically, for a pantster like me, you were just all over the keyboard. And then when it came to rereading it and rewriting it, it was like, my God, what a mess. But you'd find gems in there that you never would have created had you been really overthinking. So I think that's what I've learned most. Don't look for perfection initially. Try and do that with your rewriting and your editing. Yes, great. Go for perfection. Make sure that the colors of the curtains are the right color. Make sure that people say exactly what you want them to say in exactly the right voice, but not initially. Just get it all down. And I also find that dialogue for me is the easiest thing to write. And if I'm on a short day, I just write a conversation. That's another thing I learned. But that's more of a word count thing.
No, that's a good tip. What do you love about being indie?
I love the freedom. I love the fact that I can touch on subjects that some traditional publishers just wouldn't be interested in at all. I like actually having creative input in the cover. I like having the final say on what goes on the page. I mean, I have a fantastic editor, and she is harsh. She will tell me if she doesn't like something I've written. But at the end of the day, it's my choice as to whether I accept that or not. And, some of my books are self-published. Others are with indie publishing houses like Fantasy and Clash Books. But the creative freedom that you're allowed when you're indie is enormous. Obviously, you don't necessarily get the same push in the press. So it's a trade-off, really. But probably one of the reasons I've stuck to indie so far, if I'm completely honest with myself, is fear of rejection. I mean, my friends that are going through the process of submitting to agents, getting told they're not good enough, I'm not sure my ego could stand that. I'd be like, I'm terrible. Whereas with indie, you can get a book out and it's the feedback from the readers that you're judging your worth on. And thankfully, I mean, although there are some people that don't like my politics and will put that in a review, most of the reviews about my writing style are extraordinarily positive.
We all write with a little bit of ourselves in mind with every character, but is there been a character that you've written that is so close to you that, forgive me for the lack of a better word, frightened you, maybe?
Star. Very mixed up character in some ways, and she doesn't have a great deal of personal strength at the start. In fact, she doesn't really know herself. And in some ways, when I was writing her journey through Starblood, I was also kind of figuring out my own life. I was coming to the end of a quite a difficult relationship that I was having, that I felt I was losing myself within. And I had young children too. And I felt like I was scrabbling for some sort of sense of identity. And a lot of that ended up coming through in Star as well. And one of my best friends actually told me how much he hated Star. He thought she was a terrible character and that Satori should have dropped her years before. And I thought, oh, because as far as I'm concerned, if you take all the magic and the fantasy out, I'm pretty much Star. So I thought, wow, either you don't know me or possibly you're seeing something else in this character that is lost on me. So it actually, it's going to be quite dangerous to write about yourself. And then in my short story collection, I wrote about a very painful part of my life and then kind of made it a revenge fantasy. So that was pretty much me entirely, except for all of those fantasies I had, they came true. Be afraid. Definitely a good healing tool, a bit of horror.
What do you think is the major benefit to someone who reads, and do they need to cross genres from what they write? Is there a certain benefit that you get from that as well?
Certainly reading across genres when you're a writer is quite important, I think, because you can get added benefits from that for your own work. But as a reader, I think stick to the genre that you enjoy. But the main benefit of reading is empathy. You're actually submerging yourself in someone else's life. Now, the character might not be real, but aspects of them will be, because as you said yourself, writers put a huge amount of themselves into the characters they create. That's what brings them to life. So we are dealing essentially with real people's thought processes, even if the person that we're writing about isn't ourselves. There are going to be aspects of ourselves within each book. So you're submerging yourself in someone else's life and seeing what that life is like. Now, this is one of the reasons why I tend to read not just books by men, but books by women, not just books by people in the Western world, but people in India, people in Africa, because you're getting all of these wonderful stories and they are so rich and so different to the stories that we produce ourselves. But more than that, you immediately know that these people are human beings with exactly the same desires, the same fears as yourself. And all those barriers that are put up when we're just always looking at people that are either the same gender, the same color, the same class as ourselves, they all come breaking down because the world is vast and there are so many different people. And you get a glimpse of that each time you pick up a book and you feel deeply about someone who isn't yourself. And I think that's the key to reading. And I think perhaps that's why we have a lot of the problems we do now, because people aren't reading. People are looking at celebrity on the TV and everything is so shallow. Everything is about surface. There's no backstory. There's no depth to the people that we're idolizing. Now, you don't have to idolize a character in a book, but you understand them. And I think that's the key.